Voting day closed in Chile's presidential elections with a declared and solid victory for leftist candidate Gabriel Boric over José Antonio Cast. To go more on the matter, we now receive political analyst, journalist at the Gray Zone, and expert in Latin politics, Benjamin Norton. Be welcome, Benjamin.
Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure. So, Benjamin, we have a first question on the matter. Boric promised to work on behalf of the minorities towards Chile's prosperity and equality. We know he is not a radical leftist, and also he still has to convene with Congress and the political elites in Chile. So that leads me to a question. What can really Boric do for Chilean people?
Well, the most important thing that this election shows is that the legacy of Pinochet, the legacy of the US-installed far-right dictatorship that came into power after a CIA-backed coup in 1973 that overthrew the elected socialist president of Chile, then Salvador Allende. That legacy that Pinochet left is dead. The Chilean people just buried the legacy of Pinochet, and with this massive victory, Gabriel Boric, with 55% of the vote, now has a mandate to rewrite the constitution. This is the most important thing that will come out of this election in Chile. Of course, 2 years ago, there was a big uprising, protests against the neoliberal austerity policies of the current billionaire president, Piñera. And as a result of those protests, there was a democratic referendum in which the people of Chile voted to rewrite the constitution through a referendum. And through a convention process, rather. And now Boric has the constitutional mandate to continue moving forward to rewrite the Pinochet-era constitution. At the same time, though, we should recognize that Boric, as you mentioned, he's not a very left-wing candidate. He's certainly not a revolutionary. He spent a lot of his campaign attacking Venezuela, attacking Nicaragua, attacking Cuba. So there are goods and bads about this. But the most important thing is that José Antonio Cast, he represented the legacy of Pinochet. He openly defended the right-wing dictatorship. He openly attacked democracy. And the fact that Cast lost in this overwhelming landslide victory is a sign that the Chilean people does not want to return to the years of the Pinochet dictatorship.
You know, in a fresh tweet, you wrote, and I quote, "The pink tide is coming back in Latin American narrative is too simplistic. As someone who is cautious to be carried away by enthusiasm, I want you to abund on this affirmation, based, of course, in what Boric had said about his foreign policies on Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba in one hand, and the US in the other."
Well, there are two contradictions that we should talk about in Latin America. One is the far-right corrupt authoritarians like we see in Brazil with Bolsonaro, like we see in Colombia with Ivan Duque, like we see in Chile right now with Piñera. It's important to defeat these far-right figures. At the same time, though, there's also the contradiction of US imperialism. So Boric is certainly better than Cast. Boric is going to be an improvement on Cast because Cast was, again, he's the son of a Nazi, literally. His father was a member of the Nazi party under Hitler, and he wanted to bring back the Pinochet dictatorship policies. So that is important. But at the same time, when it comes to the other contradiction of imperialism, Boric is very weak. And the reality is that more and more in Latin America, we see that there are two different kinds of lefts that are in power. There is the revolutionary anti-imperialist left we see in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia, which are part of the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance. They're trying to fight to unify Latin America and the Caribbean, to resist US colonialism, and to be free and independent and sovereign. And then there's another left that is more moderate and that is not anti-imperialist, and it can do some good things. We've seen, for instance, that Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, and AMLO in Mexico, and now Boric, they will be able to accomplish some important things of resisting neoliberal policies and creating new progressive policies domestically. But the problem is that they sometimes do that at the expense of the leftist governments in the region. So I think the challenge now for Boric, he's going to have to choose. Is Boric going to ally with Washington against the other countries in Latin America? Or is Boric going to work with his allies, work with his neighbors in the other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean and unify the region against US imperialism? I think that is the most important question going forward for Chile.
You know, I made the same question to Donny Shaw, and he told me that's the million-dollar question, you know, because we have to see what Boric is going to do in the future, in the short-term future, I think. So now Boric inherits a country troubled by violence, repression, corruption, economic crisis, and the COVID-related health crisis also. So which are the changes he must implement on the short term to disassociate from prior administrations, and which ones are for the long term?
Well, the most important thing that Boric can do, which is something that he's talked about in terms of domestic politics, is invest in social programs, invest in universal healthcare, and invest in education. We should keep in mind that Boric comes from the student movement. He became a politician after participating in large protests over student tuition costs. And those protests were violently repressed by the Chilean government. So he understands the importance of investing in education. If you're going to invest in your people, you have to create free and low-cost public education. He also understands the importance of healthcare, especially in a moment of a global pandemic. The people of Chile need healthcare. Let's keep in mind that Chile is one of the most neoliberal societies on earth, that Chile was the laboratory for the neoliberal shock therapy policies imposed by the Chicago boys who were trained in the United States at the University of Chicago. And after the CIA overthrew Chile's elected president, Salvador Allende, in 1973, Pinochet imposed so many neoliberal capitalist policies, privatizing everything, including water. So it's going to be important to move against those neoliberal policies, to reverse the Pinochet era policies, to create universal healthcare and universal education. Those are things that Boric can potentially do. We should keep in mind that his hands will be tied because Boric does not have a majority in the parliament, in the Congress. So he's going to be limited in what he can do. But at the same time, he does have some possibilities. And I think, again, we need to stress that if he can balance those progressive policies at home with an anti-interventionist foreign policy, and if he has good relations with his neighbors in Latin America, and if he refuses to be another puppet of Washington, I think the people of Chile will be very content.
You know, what he does in foreign policies is on his hands, because Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, all those governments have congratulated and saluted his victory and also had praised his victory. So I think if he wants to cooperate with those governments, it's on his hands, because all those governments have been shown willingness to do so. But let's move on to other topics. This Sunday's morning, Chileans denounced an election boycott transport sector, as people were limited to go to the polls because of the lack of transportation means. Also, in some point of his remarks of the day, Kast hint he will challenge the election's outcome, despite he acknowledging his defeat later. What can we expect from the Chilean right after this outcome and in the future?
Well, we've already seen a hilarious narrative from the right wing in Chile. And when I say the right wing, we're talking about extremists, because Kast is not just a normal right-wing candidate. Kast is, I want to stress this point again, he's the son of a Nazi. His father voluntarily joined Hitler's Nazi party. He's of German descent, of course. And after losing World War II, Kast's father fled to Argentina and then Chile. So we're talking about someone who is a descendant of literal fascists, and Kast is a symbol of the Nazis and European fascists who fled to Latin America after World War II, after being defeated by the Soviet Union. So the fact that he was defeated, again, is very symbolic, and it's very important. But what has the response been of the Chilean extreme right? They ironically are claiming that Boric is a communist, which is hilarious, because if anyone who followed Chilean politics saw what happened in the debate, we actually saw that Boric criticized the Communist Party of Chile. It is true that there is a broad left-wing and progressive alliance that supported Boric's candidacy in the election. And it's true that one of the parties that were part of that broad coalition is the Communist Party of Chile. But Boric went out of his way to criticize the Communist Party And he said that the Communist Party should not defend Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. So the idea that Boric is a communist is hilarious because he's actually criticizing communists. But the right wing, the extreme right in Chile, is going to try to portray him as a radical leftist, even though he's not a radical leftist. And they're going to try to prevent him from implementing some of those progressive domestic policies I talked about. Now, you mentioned something important, that we saw that because of the lack of investment in public transportation, it was difficult for some Chileans to vote in this election. That is a legacy of the neoliberal policies that have been dominant in Chile since the end of the Pinochet era. There never really was a process of reversing Pinochet's policies. In fact, the constitution in Chile today is still the Pinochet era constitution. So now the challenge will be investing in public transportation, investing in education, investing in universal healthcare, investing in those kinds of social programs that could truly reverse the bipartisan neoliberal policies that we've seen. Because even though Pinochet was defeated through a democratic referendum, even though Pinochet was no longer president, in many ways, his neoliberal policies are so baked in to the Chilean political and economic system that even when presidents like Michelle Bachelet were in power, who was from the center left, even she did not really truly challenge the neoliberal framework of the Chilean government. And finally, another very important factor that we should talk about is the role of copper. Chile has some of the largest copper reserves in the world, and that copper is largely in private hands. In fact, it is largely controlled by a son-in-law of Pinochet. So I think another challenge that Boric should start talking about is if he can return to the legacy of Salvador Allende, who nationalized Chile's copper and who declared that the nationalization of the copper was the second independence, the first independence being independence from Spanish colonialism. So I think we need to talk about Boric's possibility of investing in social programs, healthcare, education, and potentially even nationalizing the copper reserves. Those are all policies that have broad support among the Chilean people.
Indeed. So thank you, Benjamin, for your time and presence here in teleSUR English and from the South.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.